Hey everybody, it's John here. So in this supplemental video, I'll show you how to construct checkpoints. And so for the checkpoints, the purpose they serve is to allow the character to respawn at the set point if they die. So in this case, for my level, I've moved the endpoint further out, and I have these two pits. And so what I want to have occur now is that if the character falls in the pit, then we'll get the you died screen. And if I hit restart, I want the character to respawn at the last checkpoint crossed. So for instance, I could put a checkpoint here, and if the character falls in the pit, they'll restart at this point. Then if the character ends up making it to the end of the game, then I want the character to then restart at the very beginning. And so the approach I'm going to show is pretty neat because it's going to use that checkpoint script that we're using for our endpoint. And so you can set it up such that if you have some wacky level where you're kind of traversing back and forth, so if you make platforms and you jump up and can kind of come back and go forward, this approach will still work as long as you set the checkpoints in the order that the character needs to reach in any one of them. So let's kind of dig into this a bit. So I'm going to come back to our GameStatusManager. So this should be attached to your character. And so within GameStatusManager, we have the reference to the end screen GUI, but we also have the reference to the start level, the end level point, and then we had this array of transforms called checkpoints that have been commented out. I'm going to go ahead and uncomment that. One more thing I want to add. I'm going to add another variable. It's going to be a private variable. So public transform, and I'm going to call it last checkpoint reached. And so really this is going to track to see what was the last checkpoint that the character crossed. And so in start, I'm going to say last checkpoint reached is equal to null. And by doing that, what I'm saying is that the character has not reached any of the checkpoints that we've identified. So in update, if you remember, what we do within the update cycle is that on every update loop, we look to see if that entered trigger flag for our endpoint has been set to true. And at that point, we know that the character has made it to the end, and then we can set up the end screen UI and get everything set up to restart. So I'm going to add some code, and I got ahead of myself here a little bit, but I add in a comment because what I want to do is I want to look through the checkpoints and then find the last checkpoint reached by the player. And so what we can do is we can go through the array of checkpoints and see when that entered trigger, and see if any of them have the entered trigger flag set. And if that's the case, then we want to save that one because that's when we know the character has made it to that point. So if you remember, to iterate across an array, we can do this for each loop. And so for each guarantees that we'll look at every single element in the array. So we say for each, and then say transform next checkpoint. I'm going to say in checkpoints because that's the array of points that we've identified. And now I want to look at that flag, and so it's really just going to mimic what we've done up here. So I'm going to mimic that code from the looking at the end game point. So I'm going to say if next checkpoint, and I want to get the component checkpoint and entered flag. Oops, I got to add that, or entered trigger. I'm sorry. Entered trigger. So if if the character is currently at that particular checkpoint, then we want to save it. So last checkpoint reached equals next checkpoint. Okay, so now we have that saved. So like I said, as the character goes through each of the checkpoints, this is going to get updated with the last one that the character reached. So that's kind of cool. So we have that saved. And one thing I want to note here, so this is the check to see if the player's fallen off the world. So in class, I had this set to a larger negative number, I think like -5, because the pits that I have are more shallow than that. I end up adjusting that value. So depending upon your level, you may have to tweak that number a bit just to get it set up to behave the way that you want it. Okay, so down in restart game. So right now, if you remember from the GUI, when the restart game, if the player hits the button, we call this restart game, and we're assuming we just go back to the start level. And so we don't want to make that assumption anymore. Really, now it's we want to see if the player reached a checkpoint, and if that's the case, then we want them to respawn there. So I'm going to say if last checkpoint reached equals null. So if you remember, in this case, we're saying that no checkpoint's been reached. And so here we can assume that we want the character to restart at the start point. But this brings up another point too, is that, well, what happens if the character gets to the end of the level? Because at that point, this last checkpoint reached would just be set to the last checkpoint the character made. And so we do have to make another update here. So when the character reaches that end level, so let's add one more to say remove last checkpoint reached. Character restarts at beginning. And so here we can say last checkpoint reached equal to null. Okay, so this now should cover the instances where if the player dies before hitting the first checkpoint and if they hit the end of the level. Otherwise, so else, so if we know that we do have a checkpoint reached, then let's say return player to the last checkpoint, and here we're just going to mimic what we're doing up here. So game object transform position, so this is the position of the player, and we're now going to set that to last checkpoint reached dot position. So now this should put us back at whatever the checkpoint was for the player, and that should cover it, because now, like I said, now that we have the right position set, everything else should kind of remain the same here. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to come back to Unity. So let's make sure this compiles okay. So gain the wheel, it's going through, and console looks okay. There's no errors to be had, so that's great. So I'm going to go ahead and add those checkpoints in. So what I'll do, say create empty. Actually, probably what a better idea is, so checkpoint kind of already has everything that we desire. It just has this kind of nice little checkered flag associated with it. So let's go ahead and make this into a prefab. So if you remember, to make a prefab, so here, say environment, I'm going to just copy that over here. Now I get this endpoint prefab, and so now this has, like I said, the collider that we have set to a trigger. It has a checkered flag. Probably for checkpoints, we want to put different colored flags. I just don't want to open up Piskel right now to do that. So I'll leave that to you if you decide to do something like that. So I said, because now we have this set as a prefab, it makes it easier for us to just kind of add this back into the level. So here I'm going to add a checkpoint here, and I'll just call this checkpoint 1, and copy this over here. I'll call that checkpoint 2. So I got my 2 checkpoints and my endpoint. So I'm going to come back to the player. So here I have my checkpoints enabled. I'm going to make this a size 2 because I have 2 checkpoints. Let's see, these got moved up here. So I'm going to move these. I just want to move these down to the bottom, just so for just keeping all the checkpoints kind of grouped together. So this may take a minute. So stretch your arms, stretch your legs, maybe get yourself something to drink, like I'm about to do. Because yeah, this takes a little bit of time. The other thing we can do as well is that we can group all the checkpoints together under a single object. So okay, got my 2 checkpoints here. Let's go ahead. If I make an empty object, I'm just let's put it down here, and I'm going to just call this checkpoints. And really, all I'm doing here is just to group everything together into one. Just for, let's say, if you're kind of anal retentive, this kind of helps just to keep everything managed together. Because now all my checkpoints exist in under kind of one object. So it's not necessary. Like I said, it's more just for just neatness. Okay, so the way that the elements are set up, I have to put these in the order that I expect the character to reach them. So I have checkpoint 1, checkpoint 2. So I got the 2 checkpoints there. So I said as the character reaches each checkpoint, they have to follow this order. So that's all set. So let's give this a shot and let's see what happens. So now I'm running. Okay, I hit this. So now let's say you don't see the flag pop up, which is good. And in fact, if I open up debug, let's see. So you can see last checkpoint reached here. I reached the checkpoint 1. So that's what kind of we're expecting. Whoops. So, okay. Got back. I fall into the pit. Oh no, I died. So I'm going to go ahead and restart. And I get restart back at my checkpoint. That's great. So now I'm going to make a leap. Made it. I got to this checkpoint. You can see checkpoint 2 is set. And that's what we're expecting. I fall in the pit. Ah, crap. I died again. I'm going to restart. I'm back at checkpoint 2. And now if I do this right, I can jump. Yes. And I make it to the endpoint. So it says you win. And here, this has been cleared out. So if I restart, I'm back at the start. That's awesome. And like I said, just to check. So if I don't reach that first checkpoint, I just say I'm done with this. I'm going to jump off. Oh, no. And I can decide to restart, and I'm back at the start point. Excellent. So, like I said, just with some minor modifications of GameStatusManager, you can put in these checkpoints, kind of like what I have here, and like I said, have your character kind of respawn. So, definitely try it out. I would suggest making different flags for your checkpoints, just so you don't confuse your players. That there's still more to go. But everything, like I said, this is really just kind of reusing a lot of the pieces that we already had in place. And instead of just modifying the GameStatusManager a bit, you can get this to work. So give it a shot. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to message me, and I can help you out. All right, I'll see you all next week.